wind tasted of iron and distance. Elias' heart felt it on the back of his neck, a cold premonition that slid under the collar of his worn sheepskin coat. It was the kind of wind that scoured the Wyoming prairie down to its bones, promising a winter that would not be trifled with. From his saddle, he watched the last of the autumn sun spill across Hart's Hollow, turning the cured grass to the color of old pewter. The light was thin, without warmth. Soon, snow would bury it all. His ranch was a modest claim, tucked into a crease in the land where the wind sang a slightly less mournful tune. The fences, silvered and leaning like tired old men, traced the edge of his world. Beyond them, the land rolled on, vast and indifferent, at the bottom of the hollow. Willow Run was a ghost of a creek, its water a mere whisper over smooth, pale stones. Elias's gaze lingered there. The low water was a constant, nagging worry, a debt notice written in mud and rock. He had 30 head of cattle, a loan for winter feed that felt like a stone in his gut, and the memory of his wife, Sarah, which was both a comfort and an ache. Keeping this place afloat was the only thing he had left of her. He nudged his horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, along the northern fence line. He was checking for breaks, for posts pushed over by stubborn yearlings or the ceaseless pressure of the wind. The air was getting thicker. The sky bruised purple to the west. The storm was coming on faster than he'd figured. It was then that he saw her, a figure on foot, leading a horse that favored its right foreleg. A woman, alone, in this part of the country. That was a sight rare enough to be an omen. He slowed Dust to a walk, his hand resting easy on his thigh, not far from the holstered Colt. He was not a man who looked for trouble, but he knew it often came uninvited. As he drew closer, he saw she was not a girl, but a woman full-grown. Her traveling clothes, a sturdy skirt and jacket, were coated in the fine, pale dust of the trail. A dark felt hat was pulled low, but it could not hide the weariness in her posture. The horse she led was a fine-looking sorrel, but its saddle was canted at an awkward angle. He stopped a polite distance away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt rusted from disuse, "you appear to be having some trouble." She looked up, and for a moment, he saw the deep exhaustion in her eyes before a curtain of reserve dropped over them. They were clear, intelligent eyes, the color of moss after a rain. "You could say that," she answered, her voice smoother than he expected. With a trace of an Eastern accent she tried to flatten. "My horse and my saddle came to a disagreement." Elias dismounted, his movements measured and calm. He approached her horse, running a gentle hand down its neck. "Let's see the damage." The main cinch strap had torn clean through. Cheap leather, poorly tanned. He glanced at her saddlebags, well made and heavy. An odd mismatch. "I am Elias Hart," he said, looking back at her. "My ranch is just over this rise." "Ada Bell," she replied, offering the name with a slight hesitation. She held out a gloved hand, a gesture more suited to a city parlor than a windswept prairie. He took it briefly. Her grip was firm. "You know how to tie a rein?" he asked, a hint of dry humor in his tone as he started working on a temporary fix with a length of rope from his saddle. A small smile touched her lips. "Just for a second, I do, but this one knows how to leave me." He grunted, half a laugh, half an acknowledgement of the truth in that. He worked in silence for a few minutes, his hands sure and practiced. The wind was picking up now, whipping strands of dark hair from under her hat. It carried the sharp, clean scent of snow. "This patch won't hold for long," he said, straightening up. "And that storm isn't waiting for an invitation. You had best come back with me. You can take shelter at my place until it passes." She looked from him to the darkening sky, then back. He saw the flicker of indecision, the natural caution of a woman alone in a hard land. He understood it. He simply stood, patient, letting the wind make his argument for him. A few hard pellets of sleet rattled against the brim of his hat. "I would be grateful," she said finally. "My horse as well. He can share the barn with mine. Elias said, nodding. It is not much, but it is sturdy. He helped her mount her horse, the repaired saddle settling with a creak. He swung back up on dust, and they rode toward the hollow. As they crested the rise, the ranch came into view, a small, solid-looking cabin with a stone chimney, a good-sized barn, and a web of corrals. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the bruised sky. Ada Bell said nothing, but he saw her gaze sweeping over the land, taking in everything. It was not a casual glance. Her eyes seemed to measure and weigh. She looked at the line of cottonwoods along the creek, at the slope of the hills, and lingered on a cluster of old, lichen-covered stones near the fence post he'd just repaired. He had used them as a corner marker for years, just as his father had before him. To him, they were just rocks. To her, they seemed to hold some significance. He led her horse into the barn, the air inside warm with the scent of hay and animals. A small girl with his late wife's fiery red hair and a spray of freckles across her nose appeared in the barn doorway. "Uncle Elias, you're back. June is freezing," she announced. This was his niece, June, who had lived with him since her parents had passed 2 years prior. She was the heart of the place, the small, bright flame that kept the shadows at bay. "I am back," he said, a rare warmth softening his voice. "And we have a guest. This is Miss Bell. She'll be staying with us through the storm." June's eyes, wide and curious, fixed on Ada. "Are you lost?" "Miss Bell." Ada smiled, a genuine smile this time that changed her whole face. "I suppose I was, for a little while." While Elias unsaddled her horse and rubbed it down, he noticed her walking along the edge of the corral. She was not wandering. She was pacing, her steps even, her gaze fixed on the ground. She walked 20 paces, stopped, turned, and looked toward the cypress grove that bordered his property to the east, a dense stand of trees on a low ridge. It was the one piece of land that held its green deep into the fall. He'd always thought of it as public land, unclaimed and unused. When the creek ran low like this, he'd sometimes mended a section of his own fence, leaving a gap for his cattle to wander through for better forage and water. It was a common practice out here, a neighborly understanding with the land itself when there were no neighbors to ask. He saw her pause and stare intently at the grove, a strange, proprietary look in her eyes. It made him feel, for a fleeting moment, like a trespasser on his own property. Shaking the feeling off, he called out, "Supper will be ready soon. June makes a fine stew, though she is a bit heavy-handed with the pepper." Over a simple meal of beef stew and hard biscuits in the small, warm cabin, the storm broke in earnest. Wind howled in the chimney, and sleet hammered against the single glass window pane like a frantic fist. Ada ate with a quiet appetite, answering June's endless questions with a gentle patience. She spoke of coming from the east, of wanting to see the country, vague answers that gave nothing away. Elias listened more than he spoke, observing her. She was not what she seemed. Her hands, though gloved when he met her, were not the soft hands of a city lady. There were calluses on her palms, and a faint, pale scar across her knuckles. She moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that suggested she was used to looking after herself. Later, while June was asleep in her small loft bed, Elias sat by the fire, mending a bridle. Ada was reading a book she had pulled from her saddlebags, a slim volume of poetry. But he noticed her eyes were often lifted from the page, staring into the fire, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. "That cypress grove to the east," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Good grazing in there. When Willow Run gets this low, it is a godsend. Public land. Far as anyone knows, a man can feel the difference, crossing from owned land to land that belongs to no one but itself." He saw a flicker in her eyes, something unreadable that she quickly masked. "Is that so?" she murmured, her gaze returning to her book. But she was not reading. He knew it. The seed of conflict, unspoken and unseen, had taken root in the warm, firelit cabin. She knew something about that land. He was sure of it, and her silence on the matter felt heavy, like the snow-laden clouds pressing down on the roof. He felt the old shame rise in him, the debtor's anxiety. If that land was not public, if someone filed a claim, he would lose that safety net. Winter would be harder. The note at the Red Willow Mercantile would come due, and his herd, already thin, would be thinner still. He was a man who prided himself on standing on his own 2 feet, but he knew how close he was to falling. The wind shrieked, a living thing clawing at the cabin. Suddenly, above the storm's roar, there was another sound, a sharp, violent crack, followed by a solid thud against the front of the cabin. Elias was on his feet in an instant, the bridle forgotten. He grabbed the rifle from its pegs over the mantelpiece, his movements fluid and instinctive. "Stay away from the window," he said to Ada, his voice low and hard. She had not flinched. She had simply closed her book and stood, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the door. He moved to the side of the window, peering cautiously into the maelstrom of wind and snow. He could see nothing but a swirling wall of white. Whatever had made the sound was gone, swallowed by the storm. He waited a long minute, every sense straining against the howl of the wind. Then he unbarred the door and opened it a crack, the rifle held ready. The wind tore at the door, trying to rip it from his grasp. A blast of snow and ice crystals stung his face. There, embedded deep in the thick wood of the porch post, was an arrow. Its fletching was still vibrating from the impact. A piece of paper was tied to its shaft. He pulled the door shut, barring it again. His heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He walked onto the porch, the wind cutting through his shirt, and yanked the arrow free. He untied the paper and brought it back inside, into the flickering lamplight. Ada watched him, her face pale but composed. He smoothed out the crumpled, damp paper on the table. The words were crudely scrawled in charcoal. "Leave Willow Run. This water ain't for you." Elias stared at the words, the world narrowing to that single, brutal message. The storm outside was no longer just a battle against nature. Someone had brought a different kind of storm right to his door, and the woman standing by his fire, the stranger with knowing eyes and a secret about the land next door, was somehow, he was certain, standing right in the middle of it. The fragile piece of his hollow had been shattered. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world scoured clean and silent. Inside the cabin, the quiet was of a different sort. It was heavy, layered with the unspoken questions hanging between Elias' heart and the woman who called herself Ada Bell. The crude threat scrawled on the paper lay on the mantelpiece, a dark stain on the morning's fragile peace. June, bless her innocent heart, seemed to be the only one untouched by the tension. She chattered about the new blanket of snow, her voice a bright thread in the heavy silence, while she stirred a pot of beans and bacon on the cast-iron stove. Elias watched Ada over the rim of his coffee cup. She had not asked about the arrow again, but he saw the new watchfulness in her eyes. She moved with a quiet purpose, as if the threat had stripped away some of her weariness and replaced it with a sharpened resolve. After their breakfast of beans and coffee, she took the torn cinch strap from her saddle and, with a small kit from her own bags, began to repair it with a skill that surprised him. Her stitches were small, even, and strong. She worked not like a lady amusing herself with needlepoint, but like someone who knew the cost of broken gear miles from any town. The day unfolded in a series of shared, unspoken tasks. The air outside was sharp and cold, the sun a pale disk in a white sky. Elias cleared a path to the barn, his shovel scraping against the frozen ground. When he returned, he found Ada had helped June tidy the entire cabin. Later, he saw her outside, expertly tightening the ropes on a leaning section of the water trough he had meant to fix for weeks. She did not ask for permission. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. It was unsettling. He was used to his solitude, to the familiar landscape of his own burdens. Her competence was a silent intrusion, a force that shifted the balance of his small world. The next day, the need for supplies drove him toward Red Willow. The feed loan felt heavier than ever, and now there was a new kind of debt to consider: the cost of vigilance. He needed more lamp oil, more coffee, and to hear what talk, if any, was moving through town. "I am coming with you," Ada said. It was not a request. Elias hesitated. "It is better if you stay here, with June." "A lone woman at a remote ranch is not better," she stated calmly, her gaze unwavering. "Whoever sent that arrow knows I am here. There is no hiding from that. I will be safer with you." He could not argue with her logic. The ride to town was cold and mostly silent. Red Willow was not much more than a wide, muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place where ranchers, prospectors, and drifters mingled. The heart of the town was Alma Turner's saloon and boarding house, a 2-story building that smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and secrets. As they pushed through the bat-wing doors, a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to them. Elias felt the weight of their stares, the speculative glances that lingered on Ada. He was the quiet widower from the hollow, and she was the stranger. Their arrival together was fuel for a dozen different stories, none of them likely to be true. Alma Turner, a woman whose face was a roadmap of every hardship and joy the territory had to offer, polished the bar with a practiced hand, her eyes missing nothing. "Elias," she greeted him, her voice raspy. "Storm did not blow you away, I see, and you have brought company." "Miss Bell," Elias said by way of introduction. She was caught in the weather. He saw the gossip pass like a current through the room. A widower and a strange woman. It was a simple, damning equation in a place like this. He ignored it, ordering coffee for both of them. He was listening for a different kind of talk. He did not have to wait long. 2 men from the big Pike spread, the Bar P, were speaking loudly at a corner table, their voices carrying, "Pike says that whole watershed, all the way down from the cypress grove, is part of his new water rights claim. Says he has papers from the territorial office. Anyone watering their stock in Willow Run from now on is going to be paying him for the privilege." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Baron Pike was the biggest cattleman in the county, a man who saw the land not as a home, but as an asset to be bled dry. His ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the prairie itself. Claiming Willow Run would be a death sentence for the small ranchers like himself. The arrow, the threat, it all snapped into focus. It was not just a random act of malice. It was the opening move in a war over water. Ada's face was a careful, neutral mask, but he saw her hand tighten around her coffee cup. She was listening intently. On the ride back to the hollow, the silence between them was different. It was no longer just the quiet of 2 strangers. It was the shared silence of 2 people staring down the same enemy. Before they reached the turnoff to his land, Elias reined in his horse in front of the town butcher's small corral. Inside was a single, fine-looking bull calf, one he had been raising to improve his herd. It was his last piece of real promise for the coming year. He stared at it for a long moment, the calculation of loss and survival playing out across his face. Then, with a sigh that seemed to pull the breath from deep in his soul, he dismounted. Ada watched from her horse as he negotiated with the butcher. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the way his shoulders slumped just a fraction when the deal was done. She saw the small pouch of coins he tucked into his coat, and she knew without asking that the money was for hay, for the survival of the rest of his herd. The price was his future. The truth burned on her tongue. She wanted to tell him that the cypress grove and the headwaters of Willow Run were not Pike's to claim, that they belonged to her, that the land he had been using as a safety net was, in fact, hers by legal inheritance. But looking at his face, etched with the strain of this small, devastating defeat, she could not. To tell him now would be to heap another burden on a man already carrying too much. He would see it as a judgment, another failure. He would see her not as an ally, but as another person with a claim on what little he had left. So she held her peace, and the secret felt like a stone she had swallowed. That afternoon, while Elias was gone, hauling the precious hay he had bought with his future, Ada saddled her sorrel. She told June she was going for a short ride to exercise the horse. She rode directly to the cypress grove, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She carried a compass and a worn, folded document from her saddlebags, a copy of an official survey from the United States Geological Survey, dated 1879. She found the old cypress tree easily enough, a giant that stood sentinel over the grove. The air was still and cold beneath its branches. She ran her hand over the rough bark, her fingers tracing the faint, scarred outline of a letter B, carved there decades ago by her uncle, Benjamin Bellamy. This was his land. Now it was hers. Following the old survey map, she paced out the boundary line. Just as she suspected, the corner marker Elias used, the cluster of lichen-covered stones, was a good 100 yards inside her property line. She searched the undergrowth nearby, her boots sinking into the damp, cold earth. Finally, she found it, nearly swallowed by brush and soil, a single, square-cut stone with the faint markings of the original survey. It had been deliberately moved. Pike had not just made a claim. He had stolen the land to support it. She was staring at the displaced marker, the proof of the crime in her hands, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. It was not Elias. She slipped back into the cover of the trees, her hand resting on the small pistol she wore holstered under her coat. A man wearing the badge of a deputy sheriff rode into the clearing. He was a big man with a florid face and small, cold eyes. This was Deputy Hale, a man known to be more loyal to Baron Pike's payroll than to the law. He dismounted and looked around, a smirk playing on his lips. He walked over to the new, false marker and nudged it with his boot, as if admiring his own handiwork. Then he remounted and rode off in the direction of Hart's Hollow. Ada hurried back to the ranch, a cold dread settling over her. She arrived only moments before Hale did. He found her and Elias in the barn. "Hart," Hale said, his voice oozing a false geniality. "Just making my rounds. Heard you had a visitor." His eyes slid over to Ada, a look of insolent appraisal in them. "Town ordinance, for safety's sake. You understand, any woman traveling alone, a stranger to the area, is supposed to register at the boarding house in town, so we can keep an eye on things, make sure she stays out of trouble." The insult was plain, wrapped in the thin cloth of official procedure. Elias stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Ada. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "This is my property, deputy," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as river ice. "Miss Bell is my guest. Her safety is my concern. Now, unless you have a warrant, you can turn your horse around and leave." Hale's smirk faltered. He looked from Elias's unyielding face to Ada's steady gaze and seemed to decide it was a fight he did not want. "Not yet. Just doing my job." "Hart," he grumbled, and wheeled his horse around, kicking up dirt as he left. That night, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The unspoken had become a wall between them. They were allies of circumstance, bound by a common enemy, but divided by secrets. The attack came after midnight. It started with the frantic barking of Elias's dog. Then came a sharp, metallic snap, followed by another, the sound of fence wire being cut. Elias was already moving, pulling his rifle from its pegs. He looked at Ada. To his surprise, she was holding the small, business-like pistol he had only glimpsed before. Her face was set, her eyes clear and focused. "Stay inside with June," he ordered. "They are cutting the fence to your cattle pen," she said, her voice low and steady. "You will need another gun." He did not have time to argue. Together, they slipped out into the freezing, moonless night. They could hear the low, panicked sounds of the cattle and the muffled curses of men working in the dark. They crept along the side of the barn, using the shadows for cover. Two figures were working quickly, cutting a wide gap in the fence. Elias raised his rifle and fired into the air. The shot echoed through the hollow like a thunderclap. "Get off my land," he roared. One of the figures fired back, a wild shot that splintered the corner of the barn. In the flash, Elias saw their faces, men who worked for Pike. Ada stepped out from behind the barn, raised her pistol, and fired twice. She did not aim at the men. She aimed at the ground in front of their feet, sending dirt and gravel spraying into their faces. It was a clear, unmistakable message. "We can see you. We are not afraid, and we will not miss next time." The men scrambled back, cursing, and disappeared into the darkness. The sound of their horses galloping away faded into the night. Elias and Ada stood in the silence, the sharp smell of gunpowder hanging in the frigid air. He looked at her, at the small, capable pistol in her hand, and saw not an Eastern lady, but a woman who knew how to stand her ground. "You are not a bad shot," he said, the words an admission of respect. "I have had cause to practice," she replied, her voice tight. As they stood there, a strange sound began, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the frozen ground. The roof of the barn, the brim of his hat. It grew louder, harder. The sky had opened up. It was not snow this time, but a downpour of ice. Hailstones, small at first, then growing to the size of marbles, hammered down upon them, stinging their faces and hands. They ran for the shelter of the cabin, the roar of the hail chasing them. Inside, the world was reduced to the sound of the storm, a relentless, violent drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. It was the sound of a new and greater fury, a promise that the small skirmishes were over, and the real battle was about to begin. The hailstones were a volley of stones cast by an angry sky. They hammered the roof of the cabin, the frozen ground, and the spirits of the two people standing in the dark. Elias Hart and Ada Bell ran for the house, the relentless barrage chasing them, each impact a small, sharp blow. Inside, the world was a deafening roar. June was awake, sitting bolt upright in her loft bed, her eyes wide with fear. A small calico cat was clutched in her arms, its own fear a palpable tremor. The hail lessened, but the wind rose to a shriek, and the ice was replaced by a driving, horizontal rain that froze on impact. It was a storm that meant to break things. Elias moved to the window, wiping the condensation to peer into the turbulent darkness. The world outside was a churning chaos of wind and water. He could barely make out the lines of the barn, a dark shape heaving against the night. Then came a sound that was not the storm. It was a deep, groaning crack of tortured wood, followed by a splintering crash that was swallowed almost immediately by the wind's howl. "The barn," Elias said, his voice grim. He did not need to see it to know the wind has found a weak spot. Ada was already pulling on her still damp coat. "The cattle." He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. This was not her fight, but the look she returned was resolute. In the flickering lamplight, he saw the same steady nerve she had shown when she fired her pistol at the feet of Pike's men. They were past the point of polite questions and easy refusals. "Stay here." "June," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "Bar the door behind us. Do not open it for any reason until we are back." The girl nodded, her small face a pale oval in the dim light. Stepping outside was like walking into a solid wall of water and wind. The cold was immediate and savage, stealing the breath from their lungs. Ice coated every surface, making the ground a treacherous sheet. They fought their way toward the barn, heads down, shoulders hunched against the onslaught. He saw the damage as they got closer. A large section of the roof over the new cattle pen had been torn away, ripped clean off and flung somewhere into the darkness. The remaining timbers groaned under the assault of the wind. Inside the pen, the cattle were panicked, bellowing in terror, huddled together against the far fence as the freezing rain lashed down on them. They would not survive the night like this. "We have to get them into the main barn," Elias yelled over the storm. It was a desperate, brutal task. The gate to the pen was glazed with a thick layer of ice, the latch frozen solid. Elias had to smash it open with his shoulder, the impact jarring him to the bone. The cattle, wild with fear, refused to move toward the narrow opening into the main barn. They milled and pushed, their hooves slipping dangerously on the icy mud. There was no room for planning, only for action. Elias plunged into the chaos, his voice a low, calming rumble he used with spooked animals, his hands pushing and guiding. Ada was right beside him, a surprisingly solid presence in the storm. She grabbed a length of rope and, with a quick, efficient movement, created a moving barrier, using it to guide the terrified animals toward the barn door. She did not flinch when a panicked steer slammed against the fence near her head. She moved with a dancer's grace and a ranch hand's grit, her small frame belying a strength that came from somewhere deeper than muscle. One by one, they forced the animals through the doorway, a frantic, steaming crush of hide and horn. The last calf, small and terrified, slipped and went down, its thin legs splaying on the ice. Before Elias could react, Ada was there, hauling the shivering animal to its feet, her arms wrapped around its neck as she half-dragged, half-pushed it into the safety of the barn. Finally, the last of them was inside. They slammed the heavy barn door shut, the sound a solid thud of finality against the storm. The relative quiet inside was a blessing. The air was warm and thick with the familiar, earthy smell of hay and animals. For a long moment, they both leaned against the door, chests heaving, soaked to the skin, the roar of the wind a muted beast on the other side of the wood. In the dim light of the single lantern hanging from a beam, Elias looked at her. Her hair was plastered to her face, water dripped from the brim of her hat, and her coat was dark with rain. But her eyes were alive, shining with a fierce, bright energy. They had faced the storm together, and they had won. A bond had been forged between them in the freezing mud and chaos, a silent acknowledgement of mutual reliance and respect that went deeper than words. They stumbled back to the cabin, the warmth inside a physical shock after the biting cold. June, who had been waiting anxiously by the door, ran to Elias and hugged him tightly. He held her for a moment, his hand stroking her hair, before sending her back to her warm bed in the loft. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, a small, lit island in a raging sea of darkness. Elias built up the fire in the hearth, and soon it was blazing, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. Ada shed her soaked coat and hung it on a peg near the fire, where it immediately began to steam. She shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor she could not control. Elias moved to the stove and put the coffee pot on to heat. His movements were slow, weary. The ordeal had drained him, but as he worked, he was acutely aware of her. He watched the firelight catch the damp strands of her hair and glint in the droplets of water on her cheek. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw and the exhaustion she could no longer hide. He looked at her wet coat hanging beside his own. Two dark shapes joined in the warmth of the hearth. Something had shifted between them tonight. The stranger he had taken in out of a sense of duty was gone. In her place was a woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him, who had fought for his home, his livelihood, as if it were her own. He poured 2 cups of the strong, black coffee, its bitter aroma filling the small room. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed, and the brief contact was like a spark. She was huddled on the hearth rug, as close to the flames as she could get, her hands wrapped around the warm tin cup. He sat down not far from her, the fire warming one side of his body, the chill of the storm still clinging to the other. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the symphony of the storm. The wind howled its mournful song around the corners of the cabin, and the rain hammered a frantic, endless rhythm on the roof. Inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that comes after a shared trial. He looked at her again, at her profile traced in gold by the firelight. He thought of her leaving when the weather cleared, of her riding away down the hollow, leaving him alone again with his debts and his ghosts. The thought left a surprising emptiness in his chest. The words came to him then, simple and unadorned, born of the storm and the warmth of the fire. He said it softly, his voice a low, gravelly thing, a little clumsy with sincerity. "Stay at my ranch until the storm passes." He said it without knowing the truth, without an inkling of the secret she carried. He said it because in that moment, in the heart of the tempest, the thought of her being anywhere else felt wrong. He was offering shelter to a traveler, nothing more. But the words held the weight of something else, a silent plea he did not even understand himself. Ada looked up from her cup, her moss-green eyes meeting his. She saw no pity in his gaze, only a straightforward, weary kindness, a genuine concern, and in that moment, the weight of her deception pressed down on her with a crushing force. This man, this quiet, honorable man who was fighting so hard to hold on to his small piece of the world, was unwittingly offering sanctuary to the very person who held a legal claim to the land he depended on. He was sheltering the woman he had been trespassing against. She felt like a fraud, a parasite, accepting his coffee, his warmth, while hiding a truth that would feel like a betrayal to him. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will." A small voice piped up from the shadows near the loft ladder. "Is the coffee still as bitter as medicine, Uncle Elias?" June stood there, her hair a tousled mess, the calico cat cradled in her arms once more. The tension broke. A slow smile spread across Elias's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes, a genuine, unburdened smile. He looked at Ada, and she was smiling too, a soft, tentative curve of her lips. A quiet laugh escaped her, and he found himself laughing with her, a low, rusty sound. "It is," he admitted to June, "but tonight I think we have earned it." The shared laugh, small as it was, changed the air in the cabin. It was a moment of pure, unguarded connection, a fragile truce against the storm outside and the unspoken troubles between them. They were no longer just a man and a woman, but two people who had found a fleeting moment of grace in a hard world. As they settled back into a comfortable silence, June, now fully awake and curious, padded over to the fireplace. The grown-ups were being quiet and boring. She noticed Ada's coat, still steaming on its peg. Children are drawn to pockets, to the small mysteries they might contain. On an impulse, she slipped her small hand into the side pocket of the heavy, damp wool. Her fingers closed around a folded piece of paper. She pulled it out. It was a thick, important-looking document, covered in elegant, looping script that was hard for her to read. There was a fancy seal pressed into the bottom. She unfolded it carefully. She saw a lot of words about surveys and boundaries, words that meant nothing to her. But then she saw a name, written in a clear, bold hand, Bellamy. It looked and sounded a lot like the name Ada had given them, Belle. She looked over at the two adults by the fire. They were talking softly now, their heads close together. She did not want to interrupt. With the simple, unthinking logic of a child, she decided to put the interesting paper somewhere safe where it would not get lost. She looked around the room. Her eyes fell on the mantelpiece, a perfect spot. She trotted over and carefully placed the folded document on the rough-hewn wooden shelf. She set it right next to the other piece of paper that was already there, the one that had been tied to the arrow, its crude, threatening words a dark slash against the wood. The deed and the threat now lay side by side in the flickering firelight, two silent testaments to the storm that was only just beginning. The truce, forged in the heart of the storm, was as fragile as the thin sheet of ice that now coated every surface of Heart's Hollow. The world was unnervingly beautiful in the aftermath, glittering under a cold, indifferent sun. But the beauty could not hide the damage. The cattle pen roof was a skeleton of splintered timbers, and a section of fence near the creek had been flattened. The work of repair was hard and silent. Elias Hart and Ada Bell moved with a grim efficiency. Two people bound by a shared task but separated by a chasm of things unsaid. The warmth that had flickered between them by the fire was gone, replaced by a cautious, watchful distance. Word of the town meeting came on the third day, carried by a neighboring rancher on his way to Red Willow. Baron Pike had called it. The official topic was the equitable distribution of water for the coming winter. Elias knew it was a lie. Pike was not interested in equity. He was interested in ownership. This was not a meeting. It was a coronation. "I have to go," Elias said, his jaw tight. He was replacing a fence post, his movements sharp and angry. "I am going with you," Ada said from the other side of the fence, where she was expertly stretching a new length of wire. He stopped, his hands resting on the post driver. He looked at her, at the determined set of her mouth. He wanted to tell her no, to keep her here, to keep this fight his own. But he remembered Deputy Hale's visit, and the men who had cut his fence in the dark. Trouble had already found her here. "Fine," he bit out, and turned back to his work, driving the post into the frozen ground with a force that sent a shudder through his arms. Alma Turner's saloon was packed. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, cheap whiskey, and simmering anxiety. Every small rancher and homesteader for 20 miles was there, their faces etched with the same worry that gnawed at Elias's gut. He and Ada found a spot near the back, standing against the wall. He was acutely aware of the whispers that followed them, the curious and suspicious glances, the widower and the stranger. Their story was already being written for them by the town, and it was a fiction he had no energy to correct. Baron Pike stood near the bar, looking less like a rancher and more like a king holding court. He was a large man, soft in the middle but with a hard, unyielding glint in his eyes. Deputy Hale stood beside him, a bulky shadow in a stained coat. Pike let the room settle, then raised a hand for silence. His voice was smooth, oiled with a false concern. "Friends, neighbors, we all know the creek is low and the winter will be long. We are facing a hardship, but hardship is what forges us, what makes us strong. I have been thinking about a solution, a way to ensure that every family has the water they need to see them through to the spring thaw." He paused, letting his words sink in. Elias felt a cold dread creep up his spine. "I have at great personal expense," Pike continued, "secured the primary water rights to the entire Willow Run watershed, from its source in the Cypress Hills down to the flats. I have the legal papers, filed and sealed. I am prepared to build a proper dam, to manage the flow, and to sell water to each of you at a fair and reasonable price. No more uncertainty. No more worrying if the creek will run dry. Just a simple monthly fee for a guaranteed supply." An angry murmur swept through the room. It was not a solution. It was a stranglehold. Pike was offering to sell them the very water that had been free for generations. He was turning a shared resource into his personal property. "That is thievery!" someone shouted from the crowd. Deputy Hale stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Mr. Pike is operating within the law. His claim is legal. You will show him the proper respect." Pike smiled, a predator's smile. "I understand your concern, but this is the modern age. We must have order. We must have management." He was about to continue when a clear voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Your claim is based on a lie." Every head turned. Ada Bell had pushed away from the wall. She stood alone in a small, cleared space, her back straight, her chin lifted. She was no longer the weary traveler. She was a woman about to go to war. Elias's blood ran cold. He wanted to pull her back, to tell her to be silent, but he was frozen in place, a spectator to a drama he did not understand. Pike's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be, ma'am, to be making such a bold accusation?" "My name is Ada Bellamy," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room. "And the Cypress Grove and the headwaters of Willow Run do not belong to you. They belong to me." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. From it, she produced not the deed but the surveyor's map. She unfolded it with steady hands. This is a copy of the United States Geological Survey of this territory from 1879. It clearly shows the boundaries of the Bellamy property, a claim filed and registered by my late uncle. The property includes the entirety of the cypress grove and the northern bank of Willow Run for a half-mile. Your claim, Mr. Pike, is fraudulent. It is based on a falsified boundary line. A collective gasp went through the saloon. Elias felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Bellamy. Not Belle. He stared at her, at the woman he had sheltered, the woman he had fought beside in the storm, the woman who had watched him sell his last bull calf to survive. All this time, she had known. She had known he was trespassing every time he let his cattle drink from the deepest part of the creek. Every time he had let them graze in the grove he thought was public land. The fragile connection they had built shattered into 1,000 pieces. In its place was a hot, bitter shame. He had been a fool, a trespasser, living on the charity of a woman who had deceived him. The whole town was watching him, seeing his humiliation. Pike recovered quickly. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. A piece of paper. A woman from back east shows up with a convenient piece of paper and expects us to turn our lives upside down. This is a desperate land grab. Nothing more. She sees a valuable resource and wants to steal it for herself, to drive up the price of water and bleed us all dry. He was good. He was turning her legitimate claim into an attack on the community, painting her as the greedy outsider and himself as the town's protector. My claim is legal and can be verified by the land office, Ada said, her voice unwavering, though Elias could see the slight tremor in her hands. Deputy Hale stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Elias. Hart, you have been harboring this woman, scheming with her. Are you? I think it is high time I paid a visit to your ranch. A proper visit, to see what else you two might be hiding. The threat was clear. It was an attempt to isolate them, to punish him for his association with her. Elias finally found his voice. It was a low, dead thing. You are not welcome on my land. Hale. The confrontation dissolved into a chaotic argument, with men shouting on all sides. But Elias heard none of it. He saw only Ada's face, her plea for understanding in her eyes. He turned away from it, turned his back on her, and pushed his way through the crowd and out into the cold, clean air. She followed him. The ride back to the hollow was a long, frozen silence. The air between them was colder than the wind that cut across the plains. He did not look at her. He could not. When they reached the ranch, he dismounted and began unsaddling his horse with rough, angry movements. She stood by her own horse, her face pale, her hands twisting the reins. "Elias, please," she began. "You have to let me explain." Explain what he said, his voice dangerously quiet as he turned to face her. Explain that you stood by and watched me sell off the best part of my future to buy hay, all while knowing I was a trespasser on your land, that you let me believe I had a right to that water, to that grazing. You could have said something sooner. The words were quiet, but they struck her like a slap. "When was I supposed to say it?" she cried, her composure finally breaking. "When you found me on the road, a lone woman with a broken saddle, or when your neighbor was spreading rumors about us in town, or when your deputy was trying to intimidate me. This world out here, it is not kind to a woman alone. A woman who owns land is seen as an aberration, a prize to be taken. I had to be sure of my ground. I had to understand what I was facing." She took a breath, her voice dropping, filled with a pain that went far beyond their current conflict. "You do not understand. My parents died of the fever when I was 16. I was raised by relatives who saw me as nothing more than a burden to be married off to the first suitable man. A business transaction. This land was my uncle's gift to me. It is the only thing in my life that is truly mine. The only chance I have to build a life of my own, to not be dependent on the whims of a husband or the charity of relatives. I was not trying to deceive you. I was trying to survive." He listened to her story, and a part of him, the decent part, understood her fear. He saw the truth of her words in the harsh lines of the world around them. But his pride was a fresh, gaping wound, and her reasons were like salt in it. He had been fighting for his own survival, and she had made him a pawn in her fight without his knowledge. She took a step closer to him, her eyes pleading. "You owe me an apology for thinking the worst of me." He looked at her, at the woman who was both a stranger and the most intimate partner in his struggle. He saw the legal truth and the emotional betrayal, and they were tangled together in a knot he could not begin to unravel. "I owe you," he said, his voice rough and low. "A new fence." The words hung in the frigid air between them, a declaration of both his acceptance of her claim and his rejection of her plea for understanding. He would respect her boundary line. He would not, could not, bridge the emotional one she had created. He turned without another word and walked toward the barn, the place that felt more like a home to him than the cabin did right now. He left her standing alone in the cold, the vast, empty sky stretching out above them. She watched him go, a profound sense of loss settling over her. She had won the battle in the saloon. For now, she had stated her claim and stood her ground. But she had lost the one person in this desolate land who had shown her kindness. She had lost her only ally. Later, from the dark doorway of the barn, Elias looked up at the ridge that marked the edge of the Bellamy property. A slow, lazy circle was being drawn against the pale evening sky. A pair of vultures, their dark wings stark against the fading light, were riding the wind currents. They were patient. They were waiting. A sign of the danger that was no longer hiding in the shadows, but was now circling in plain sight, ready for something to die. A cold and bitter peace settled over Heart's Hollow, the kind of quiet that follows a declaration of war. Elias Hart moved through his days like a ghost on his own land. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and devoid of warmth. He built the new fence himself, a straight and solid line that followed the true boundary Ada had indicated. Each post he drove into the hard ground felt like a nail in the coffin of the trust that had briefly existed between them. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her presence beyond what was required by the barest civility. He was a man walled off, his pride a fortress with no gate. Ada felt his silence as a physical weight. She kept to the cabin, busying herself with mending and cooking, her every action an apology he refused to see. She watched him from the window, his solitary figure a study in rigid unforgiveness. The land that was supposed to be her liberation had become a prison, shared with a man who looked at her as if she were the embodiment of his ruin. She was caught between the rightness of her claim and the wrongness of her deception. And the space between the two was a desolate no man's land. The retribution she had expected was not long in coming. Deputy Hale arrived 2 days later, not alone this time, but with two of Pike's hard-faced ranch hands for company. They were not there for a conversation. "Hart," Hale announced, swinging down from his horse. "Got a report of stolen property, a complaint from Mr. Pike himself. Says you have been helping yourself to his supplies." "That is a lie," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood on his porch, his hands empty at his sides, but his posture was as unyielding as an old oak. "We will see about that," Hale sneered. "I have a warrant to search the premises." He produced a piece of paper that looked official enough to be a threat. Ada came to the cabin door but said nothing. She knew arguing would be pointless. This was not about justice. It was a show of force, a public humiliation. Hale and his men moved with a practiced, deliberate insolence. They ransacked the barn first, kicking over buckets and tossing aside tools. They found nothing. Elias watched them, his face a mask of stone, but Ada could see the muscle twitching in his jaw. Then they moved to the small shed where Elias cured the hides from the few animals he slaughtered for his own use. Hale emerged a moment later, a triumphant smirk on his face. He was holding a small canvas sack. Well, what have we here?" He upturned the bag, and a small mound of coarse salt spilled onto the ground. Stenciled on the side of the sack in black letters was the unmistakable brand of the Bar P. "Pike's own special blend for curing," Hale said, his voice dripping with false gravity. "Funny how it ended up in your shed. Hart, looks like Mr. Pike's complaint holds water after all." "I have never seen that sack before in my life," Elias said, his voice perfectly even, though his eyes burned with a cold fire. "That is what they all say," Hale scoffed. "You are to come with me to town. You will have to explain this to the magistrate." It was a setup, clumsy and obvious, but effective. In a town where Pike's word was law, a branded sack of salt was as good as a signed confession. Elias looked at June, who had come to stand beside Ada, her small face pale with confusion and fear. He looked at the ranch, at the memories of his wife etched into every beam and post. Then his gaze fell on Ada, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, undiluted bitterness. This was her fault. Her arrival had brought this curse down upon him. He went without a fight, as Hale led him away. Elias did not look back. Ada knew she could not stay at the ranch. She saddled her sorrel, her mind a turmoil of guilt and fury. She rode into Red Willow, a desperate plan forming in her mind. She went straight to the saloon. It was early, and the place was mostly empty. Alma Turner was behind the bar, wiping it down with a damp cloth. "They took him," Ada said, her voice tight. Alma stopped her work and looked at her, her expression grim. "I heard. Hale was bragging about it not 10 minutes ago." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It was a plant. Girl, everyone knows it. One of Pike's men, a fellow named Jeb, was in here last night, drunk and running his mouth. Said he was going to drop a little surprise off at the Hart place for the deputy to find." The confirmation was a cold weight in Ada's stomach. "Can you testify to that?" Alma sighed, a weary, rattling sound. "And have Pike's men burn my place to the ground in the middle of the night. I have got to live here, same as everyone else. But I will tell you this. Pike is squeezing too hard. People are getting scared, and scared people can sometimes get brave. You want to help Elias. You need more than the word of a drunken cowhand. You need something solid." Ada left the saloon feeling more hopeless than ever. She walked aimlessly down the muddy street, the weight of Elias's fate pressing down on her. She had come here to claim her land, to build a new life. Instead, she had shattered an innocent man's world. She had to choose. She could press her claim, fight Pike through the courts with her maps and deeds, and maybe, eventually, win back her land. But Elias would be ruined in the process, his name blackened, his ranch likely lost, or she could help him. But how? She had no standing here, no allies. She was the outsider, the woman who had brought the trouble. Her wandering steps led her to the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. A man named Cole, broad-shouldered and quiet, worked the bellows, his face illuminated by the rhythmic orange glow of the fire. She had seen him at the town meeting, a silent observer in the back. He had a reputation for being honest, a man who kept to himself and his work. She was about to turn away when a thought struck her, a desperate, grasping hope. She remembered the displaced boundary marker, the professionally cut stone that had been moved. Someone had to have the tools and skill for that kind of work. She stepped into the forge, the heat a welcome relief from the cold. Cole looked up, his expression guarded. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice uncertain. "I need to ask you about some work you might have done, about moving a stone marker." He turned his back to her immediately, picking up a heavy hammer and striking a piece of hot iron on the anvil with a deafening clang. It was an answer without words. Defeated, she returned to the hollow. The ranch was eerily quiet without Elias. The silence accused her. June was sitting on the porch steps, her face tear-streaked. She looked up as Ada approached. "Is Uncle Elias coming home?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. "I hope so, sweetheart," Ada said, the words feeling hollow and false. She sat down beside the girl, putting an arm around her trembling shoulders. They sat like that for a long time as the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. It was then that June remembered the interesting paper. She got up and went inside, returning a moment later. She held out the folded document she had taken from Ada's coat pocket, the one she had placed so carefully on the mantelpiece. "What is this?" she asked, her childish curiosity a small, pure light in the encroaching darkness. "It has your name on it, Bellamy, and it has all these lines and numbers. Can you teach me to read the landmarkers?" Ada took the deed from the small hand. She looked at the elegant script, the official seals, the precise lines of the survey. She looked at June's upturned face, so full of innocent trust. Can you teach me? The simple question cut through the fog of her guilt and despair. It reminded her of why she had come here in the first place. Not just to win a fight, not just to own a piece of dirt, but to build something, to create a place where a person could be independent, could learn, could grow. Her dream had not been just for herself. It had been for a future that was about more than just boundary lines. It was about building the right thing, not just for herself, but for the community she hoped to join. A new resolve hardened within her. She would not let Pike and Hale destroy this place, destroy these people. She would fight, not just for her land, but for Elias. The next morning, she rode back to the blacksmith's forge. Cole was there, just as before. She walked in and stood before him, the land deed in her hand. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not here to accuse you. I am here to ask for your help. I know Deputy Hale made you move that survey marker. I know he threatened you. But he has arrested an innocent man. Elias Hart is in jail right now because of a lie that started when you were forced to move that stone. I know you are a good man. I am asking you to help me make this right." He stopped his work, the hammer held motionless in his hand. He looked at her, his face a conflict of fear and shame. He was silent for a long, agonizing minute. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the coals in the forge. "He said my contract with the territory for shoeing the sheriff's horses would be terminated," Cole said finally, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Said I might have trouble getting supplies. I have a family to feed." "And Elias has a family to feed," Ada countered gently. "He has June. What will happen to her if he is sent to prison?" Cole set the hammer down on the anvil with a soft thud. He walked over to a dusty workbench and picked up a large, leather-bound book, his ledger. He opened it, his thick finger running down a page of entries. He stopped, his finger resting on a single line. "A month ago," he said, not looking at her, "Hale came in, hired me for a private job. Said he needed a stone moved, a heavy one, paid me in cash. I wrote it down. I write everything down." He turned the ledger toward her. She saw the entry, written in a neat, precise hand, the date, the time, a description of the job relocating stone marker, Cypress Ridge. It was the proof, the solid thing Alma had told her she would need. It was the first link in the chain of lies. And it was recorded in iron and ink. "Will you testify to this?" she asked, her heart pounding. He looked up from the book, and for the first time, she saw not fear in his eyes, but a flicker of his own smoldering anger. "Elias Hart is a good man," he said. "He does not deserve this." "Yes, ma'am, I will." The sky turned a strange, jaundiced yellow, and the air grew unnaturally warm. A Chinook wind, smelling of damp earth and distant thaw, began to blow from the west, a false spring that was a harbinger of disaster. It was a warm rain falling on a month's worth of accumulated snow and frozen ground. There was nowhere for the water to go. Ada Bellamy was in the blacksmith's forge with Cole, the smith's ledger open on the anvil between them like a holy book. When they first heard the sound, it was a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was not thunder. It was the sound of the land beginning to move. They stepped outside. The rain was steady now, and the world was dissolving into a slurry of mud and slush. The rumble grew louder. From the direction of the hollow, they saw it a brown, churning wave cresting the ridge. The small earthen dam Pike had built to hoard the headwaters of Willow Run had given way. "Elias," Ada breathed, her heart seizing with a cold terror. He was still in the town's small jail, a glorified closet with a barred door. The cattle. Cole did not hesitate. He wiped his hands on his leather apron and strode toward the magistrate's office, his long suppressed anger now a hot, purposeful fire in his eyes. Ada ran for her horse. By the time she had the sorrel saddled, Cole was emerging from the office with Elias at his side. The magistrate, a man who valued order above all, had seen enough in Cole's ledger to grant Elias's release pending a full hearing. There was no time for thanks, no time for explanations. Elias's eyes met Ada's over the back of her horse, and in that single, shared glance, the chasm of bitterness and pride between them vanished. Consumed by the urgency of the moment, they were no longer accuser and accused. They were two people with everything to lose. They rode hard, the roar of the flash flood chasing them. When they reached the rise overlooking Heart's Hollow, the sight stole the breath from their lungs. Willow Run was no longer a creek. It was a raging, muddy river, a torrent of brown water, slush, and debris. It had already swept through the lower pasture, and his herd, his entire livelihood, was being driven by the rising water toward the narrow, rock-walled canyon at the end of the hollow Cutthroat Gulch. There was no thought, only instinct. Elias spurred his horse. Dust down the treacherous, muddy slope, angling to head off the terrified animals before they were funneled into the trap. Ada was right behind him. The air was filled with the panicked bellowing of cattle and the relentless, hungry roar of the flood. The water was already knee-deep on the horses, a powerful, icy current that threatened to sweep their legs out from under them. Elias reached the head of the herd first. He wheeled Dust around, turning the horse into a living barrier against the main force of the current. A desperate, valiant stand against the churning tide. The horse, trusting its rider, held its ground, muscles quivering, as the muddy water surged around it. Ada, meanwhile, uncoiled the rope from her saddle. She rode to the far side of the herd, swinging the rope, her sharp whistles cutting through the din. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, herding the cattle away from the gulch's opening, pushing them toward a small, rocky shelf of higher ground that offered their only chance of survival. It was a brutal, ugly dance of survival. Mud and ice chunks churned in the water. A young steer lost its footing and was swept away, its terrified cry a heartbreaking note in the symphony of chaos. They worked without speaking, a seamless, unspoken partnership born of desperation. He was the anchor, the unyielding wall. She was the driver, the strategic force. They were two halves of a single will, fighting back against the fury of nature with nothing but their own grit and courage. They managed to push the bulk of the herd onto the muddy, crowded shelf of rock just as the main crest of the floodwall roared past, a terrifying wave of brown water that shook the very ground. It was then that they saw the riders on the opposite ridge. Baron Pike, Deputy Hale, and a half-dozen of their men sat on their horses, watching the destruction. They had not come to help. They had come to witness the final ruin of Elias Hart. Pike spurred his horse down the slope, Hale right behind him. They stopped at the edge of the receding, but still dangerous, floodwater. "Look at all that water! Hale!" Pike shouted over the roar, a greedy, triumphant light in his eyes. "My water heart, you are trespassing in my river when this is over. I will be charging you for every last drop your pathetic herd is standing in." Hale drew his pistol, the barrel a dark, ugly circle in the gray light. "You heard him. Hart, this is Pike's land and Pike's water now. Everything the flood touches is his." But before Hale could continue his threat, another group of riders appeared on the ridge behind them. It was Cole, the blacksmith, and behind him, Alma Turner, and with them were a dozen more townspeople, their faces grim, their silence a powerful judgment. They had come to bear witness. The tide of the battle had turned. and it was no longer just about the water. The ground, saturated and unstable, gave way. With a cry of alarm, Hale's horse lost its footing on the slick, muddy bank. The deputy was thrown from his saddle, tumbling into the churning, debris-filled current. The water seized him immediately, dragging him under. His pistol lost to the flood. He came up sputtering, his face a mask of pure terror, as the current swept him toward a tangle of uprooted trees. Elias did not hesitate. He spurred dust into the dangerous water, fighting the current to get downstream of the struggling deputy. He leaned dangerously low from his saddle, his hand outstretched. "Grab on," he roared. Hale, his arrogance washed away by mortal fear, flailed wildly, his fingers brushing against Elias's before the current ripped him away again. He was being pulled under, his strength failing. Without a second thought, Elias launched himself from the saddle into the freezing, violent water. It was a shock that stole his breath, but he fought through it, swimming with powerful, desperate strokes. He reached Hale just as the man's head was about to go under for the last time, grabbing a fistful of his coat and hauling him back to the surface. "The rope!" Elias yelled, his voice raw. Ada was already there. She had thrown her rope, a perfect, clean loop that sailed over Elias's head and landed squarely around his shoulders. She had dug her heels in on the bank, the other end of the rope wrapped tight around her saddle horn, her sorrel straining against the combined weight of the two men and the force of the river. She was their anchor to the living world. Elias held on to the unconscious Hale, the rope cutting into his own shoulders as Ada and the townspeople on the bank hauled them, inch by agonizing inch, out of the flood's deadly grip. They collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping, shivering, but alive. Pike watched this unfold, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His enforcer had been saved by the very man he had come to destroy. The town was watching. His power was evaporating before his eyes. Cole walked forward, his heavy ledger held in his hand. He stopped before Pike, his quiet presence more intimidating than any weapon. "Baron Pike," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying over the receding roar of the water. "On the 4th of last month, Deputy Hale hired me to move the official survey marker on the Bellamy property line. He paid me $5 in cash to do it. I have the entry right here in my book. I wrote everything down." He read the entry aloud, the simple factual words a death sentence to Pike's scheme. Then Alma Turner pushed her way to the front, a piece of paper in her hand. "And I have here a copy of the water rights agreement you drew up," she announced, her voice ringing with scorn. "The one you had the territorial clerk, my nephew, sign under duress. He made a copy. Funny how a guilty conscience can make a man's hand shake so much he makes two of everything." The crowd murmured, their suspicion hardening into certainty. They looked from the irrefutable proof in Cole's and Alma's hands to the heroic, shivering figure of Elias Hart, and then to the greedy, cornered face of Baron Pike. They had chosen their side. Pike saw it too. The fight was lost. He turned his horse, intending to flee, but two ranchers had already moved to block his path. His escape was cut off. Deputy Hale sputtered back to consciousness on the muddy ground, only to find himself surrounded by the grim, unforgiving faces of his neighbors. Someone produced a length of rope, and his hands were bound behind his back. The flood began to recede as quickly as it had come, the roar diminishing to a sullen gurgle, leaving behind a world coated in a thick layer of brown mud, as if on cue. The clouds parted. A weak, watery ray of sunlight broke through, illuminating the scene in the canyon. It was the pale, hesitant light of a new day. A day where the law was not just a piece of paper in a rich man's pocket, but a living thing in the hands of a community that had finally found its courage. The town hall in Red Willow had never felt so much like a church. The air was heavy and still, smelling of wet wool and mud-caked boots. Nearly every homesteader and rancher who had stood on the canyon ridge was present, their faces weary but their eyes sharp and focused. They filled the rough-hewn benches, a silent jury of peers. At the front of the room, behind a simple pine desk, sat Judge Travers. He was a small, neat man with a fringe of white hair and a gaze that seemed to see right through a man's pretenses to the truth or falsehood beneath. He despised violence, but he revered the law, and he ran his courtroom with a quiet, unshakable authority. Baron Pike and Deputy Hale sat at a separate table, a space of empty air around them that was more isolating than any jail cell. Pike's face was a mask of blustering indignation, but his eyes darted nervously around the room, finding no sympathy. Hale was a deflated version of his former self, his hands cuffed in front of him, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. The hearing began without fanfare. Judge Travers looked to Ada Bellamy. "Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice calm and clear, "you have made a claim of ownership. The court will hear your evidence." Ada stood. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she did not feel like an outsider. She felt like a part of the assembly. She walked to the desk and laid out her documents, the official deed to the Bellamy property, bearing the territorial seal, and the copy of the United States Geological Survey map. Her hands were steady. "Judge Travers," she began, her voice even and strong, "my uncle, Benjamin Bellamy, filed this claim in 1875. The boundaries are clearly marked, surveyed by the territory itself. They encompass the land known as the Cypress Grove and the northern bank of Willow Run. These documents prove my legal title." The judge examined the papers. His brow furrowed in concentration. He compared the map to the official county plat book open on his desk. He nodded slowly. The documents appear to be in order. He then looked to Cole, the blacksmith. "Mr. Cole, you have a statement to make." Cole rose, his large frame seeming to fill the space beside the desk. He carried his heavy ledger, holding it as if it were a shield. He did not look at Pike or Hale. He looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice the low, rough rumble of a man unused to public speaking. "On the 4th of last month, Deputy Hale came to my forge. He hired me to move a stone, an old survey marker on the ridge. He said it was in the wrong place. He told me that if I wanted to keep my contract shoeing the county's horses, I should do as I was told and ask no questions." He opened the ledger, the pages worn and stained with the honest soot of his trade. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at an entry. "I write everything down. Sir, the date, the job, the payment. It is all right here." A low murmur went through the room. It was one thing to suspect corruption. It was another to see it laid bare in plain black ink. Finally, Alma Turner was called. She walked to the front with a confidence born of having seen it all. She placed the second copy of Pike's water rights agreement on the desk. "Judge," she said, her voice raspy, "Baron Pike here thought he could bully my nephew at the territorial office into signing this piece of foolishness. He threatened him. But my nephew, he is a good boy. Scared, but good. He did what he was told, but he made a copy first and sent it to me for safekeeping. This document proves Mr. Pike's intent to monopolize a natural water source through coercion and threats." Judge Travers read the document, his expression hardening. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over Pike and Hale, then settling on the assembled townspeople. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but every person in the room leaned forward to hear. "The evidence presented here is clear and compelling," he began. "Firstly, the court recognizes the legal title of Miss Ada Bellamy to the property described in her deed. The boundary line is where the official survey says it is. Any markers to the contrary are void." He paused, letting the finality of the words sink in. Ada felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "Secondly," the judge continued, his eyes now fixed on Elias, "the charge of theft against Mr. Elias Hart is dismissed. It is evident to this court that the charge was based on fabricated evidence as part of a campaign of intimidation. Mr. Hart, you are a free man. Your good name restored." Elias nodded once, a sharp, grateful gesture. He felt the weight of the last few weeks lift from his shoulders. "And thirdly," Judge Travers said, his voice now taking on a steely edge. "Let it be known that Willow Run is a natural waterway. According to territorial law, no single individual can claim exclusive ownership of its flow. It is a shared resource, a public trust. Any attempt to monopolize it is illegal." He looked directly at Pike. "Mr. Pike, your fraudulent claim is nullified. You and Mr. Hale will be bound over for trial on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and intimidation of a public official. The law in this territory may be young, but it is not for sale." The ride back to the hollow was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. The tension was gone, replaced by a profound, shared exhaustion. The world looked new, washed clean by the flood. A thin, hopeful sun shone down on a landscape of mud and stone. The creek was a placid, brown ribbon now, its fury spent. They rode side by side, the creak of their saddles the only sound. Elias looked over at Ada. He saw the weariness in her face, but also a new strength, a new sense of peace. The shame and anger that had consumed him felt distant now, a petty thing in the face of all that had happened. They had survived a flood, a false arrest, and the greed of a powerful man. They had done it together. He reined his horse to a stop where the new, hastily built fence met the road. "Ada," he said, his voice rough. She stopped beside him, waiting. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming hard, but he forced them out. He looked her straight in the eye. "I let my pride get bigger than the truth. I was hurt, and I wanted someone to blame. What you did, saving my herd, standing up in that courtroom, I do not know many men who would have had that kind of courage. I am sorry." A tear she did not know she was holding spilled over and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She swiped it away. "I am sorry too, Elias," she answered, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you from the start, but I was afraid, all my life. I have seen how the world treats a woman with property. She is not a person, she is a prize, a target. I was so focused on defending my claim that I forgot about the people it might affect. I never meant to cause you harm." He nodded, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw her not as a deceiver, but as a fighter, just like him, trying to carve out a place in a world that was not always kind. "Well," he said, a ghost of his old, dry humor returning, "I suppose we both had our reasons." The next few days were a time of quiet rebuilding, both on the land and within the community. In town, Alma Turner cleared a corner of her saloon. She tacked up a large bulletin board and a hand-painted sign that read, "The Willow Run Corner Public Notices and Fair Dealings." She posted a copy of Ada's survey map and the judge's ruling for all to see. It became a place where people shared information, posted notices about stray cattle or the need for an extra hand at calving time. The town's gossip corner had become its public square, a place of transparency and mutual support. At the hollow, June, filled with a sense of purpose, found a smooth, flat piece of wood. With a piece of charcoal, she carefully lettered her own sign and, with Elias's help, nailed it to a post near the creek in a child's earnest scrawl. It read, "Water is for sharing. Keep it clean. Leave some for others." On a cool, clear morning, Elias found Ada standing by the fence line he had built in his anger. She was looking across at his land, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the newly cleaned pasture. "That fence is on your property," he said, coming to stand beside her, about 10 yards inside the true line. "I know," she said. "I was thinking, maybe we could take it down." He looked at her, then at the land, his land, her land. For the first time, the line between them did not feel like a wall. It felt like a simple fact, a place where two different worlds met. "A person needs to know where they stand," he said quietly. "But a fence does not have to be a fortress." He paused, a new idea taking shape. What if we build a new one together? On the proper line. And what if we put a gate in it? She looked at him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "I would like that," she said. "And I was also thinking about the water, The judge said it was a shared trust. In the dry season, my part of the creek holds the deepest pools. Your pastures have the best grass. Perhaps we could draw up an agreement, a proper one, about sharing. He returned her smile, a real one this time, that reached all the way to his eyes. I would like that very much, Miss Bellamy. The work was hard, but it was good work. They tore down the old fence together, pulling the posts from the muddy earth. They were not just removing a barrier of wood and wire. They were dismantling the wall of pride and misunderstanding that had stood between them. The air was filled with the clean scent of damp earth and the rhythmic sound of their labor, a sound that was, in its own way, a kind of healing. The winter broke, not with a sudden crack, but with a slow, gentle surrender. The Chinook winds that had brought the flood were followed by a hesitant but persistent sun. The thick, oppressive blanket of snow receded, revealing a landscape of rich, dark mud that steamed in the morning light. And then, almost overnight, the first blush of green appeared, a tender fuzz on the southern slopes and along the chastened banks of Willow Run. Spring had come to Heart's Hollow, and it felt less like a new season and more like a quiet miracle. The rhythm of life settled into a new pattern, one of shared labor and easy silence. The fence that now stood on the true boundary line between the Hart Ranch and the Bellamy property was a testament to this new world. It was a fine, sturdy fence, with a wide, well-oiled gate that swung open with the slightest touch. It was almost never closed. Elias and Ada moved between the two properties as if they were one. In the mornings, he would often be in her cypress grove, helping her clear the undergrowth from the patch of land she had chosen for her orchard. His axe would ring out in the crisp air, a steady, purposeful sound. In the afternoons, she would be in his barn, her skilled hands helping to mend harnesses or tend to the new crop of calves that were just now finding their wobbly legs. They did not speak of the future in grand terms. Their promises were not made in words, but in the calluses on their hands and the shared sweat on their brows. The future was something you built, one fence post, one cleared acre, one healthy calf at a time. One morning, a new sound joined the familiar chorus of the ranch. It was the high, thin wail of a newborn. Elias found the mother, a first-time heifer, in a thicket near the creek. The calf was small, and its breathing was shallow. He carried it back to the barn, its small body a fragile weight in his arms. He laid it on a bed of clean straw near the stove, but it would not take milk, and a telltale shiver ran through its tiny frame. He was sitting with the calf, trying to rub some warmth back into its limbs. When Ada came in, she did not ask what was wrong. She knelt beside him, her hand gently stroking the calf's wet coat. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a bottle of warm water mixed with a little molasses and a spoonful of the whiskey Elias kept for medicinal purposes. She pried the calf's mouth open and patiently, drop by drop, coaxed the warm liquid down its throat. They sat together in the quiet of the barn for hours, the world shrinking to the small, struggling life in the straw. They did not speak much. They did not have to. He watched the way her hands were so gentle, yet so sure. She watched the worry in his eyes, a deep, quiet concern that revealed the true nature of the man beneath the stoic exterior. Slowly, miraculously, the shivering lessened. The calf gave a weak bleat and tried to lift its head. A few hours later, it was taking milk from its mother with a hungry vigor. "You have a way with lost causes," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. She looked up at him, a small, tired smile on her face. "It seems to be a specialty of mine." June, meanwhile, had found a new and fascinating occupation. Ada had kept her promise and was teaching the girl to read the land. They would walk the property for hours, June clutching a small, homemade book of blank pages. Ada taught her how to read the rings on a tree stump, how to identify the tracks of a deer or a coyote, how to tell by the lean of the trees which way the prevailing wind blew. June would carefully sketch the things she saw in her book, a hawk's feather, the shape of a particular rock, the bend in the creek. She called it her land book. One afternoon, Elias came upon them sitting on the bank of Willow Run. June was pointing at the opposite bank. "That is your land, Uncle Elias, and this side is Ada's land, and the water belongs to both." "That is right," Ada said softly, her arm around the girl's shoulders. "The water is for sharing." Elias stood there, listening to them, and he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. This was home. It was not just the land, the cabin, the cattle. It was this. It was the quiet strength of the woman beside him, and the bright, fierce love he felt for the child who was his niece, but who felt like his own daughter. The apricot saplings Ada had so carefully transported from the east had survived the journey and the winter. They were little more than switches, but small. Green buds were beginning to appear on their thin branches. Together, they planted them on a gentle, sun-drenched slope on Ada's side of the creek, a place that would be sheltered from the worst of the wind. They dug in the rich, dark earth, their hands side by side. "It will be years before they bear fruit," she said, tamping the soil around the base of a small tree. "Good things are worth waiting for," he replied, and the simple words held a world of meaning. They were no longer just planting trees. They were planting a future. They were planting roots. Later that week, as the sun was beginning to set, a bank of dark clouds rolled in from the west, the kind that promised a sudden spring squall. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain, and the sky turned a dramatic shade of bruised purple. It was a familiar sight, a reminder of the storm that had first thrown them together. They were walking back from the newly planted orchard, their steps in sync. The wind whipped a strand of hair across Ada's face, and she pushed it back, a small smile playing on her lips. Elias stopped and looked at her, his own face breaking into a slow, easy grin. The memory of that first night was there, in the air between them, but it no longer held any bitterness. It was simply a part of their story. He looked up at the darkening sky, then back at her, his eyes full of a quiet, steady affection that was more powerful than any passionate declaration. "If another storm comes," he said, his voice low and soft, a stark contrast to the rising wind, "you can stay until it passes." This time, the words were different. The first time, they had been an offer of charity to a stranger in need. This time, they were an affirmation of a shared life. This time, they both knew exactly who owned the land on either side of the fence. This time, the gate between their two worlds stood wide open, not because of a storm, but because they had chosen to open it themselves. She did not need to answer. She simply slipped her hand into his, her smaller, calloused hand fitting perfectly in his larger one. They walked back to the cabin together as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Not as a rancher and a landowner, not as a widower and a stranger, but as two people who had found in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West a place to call home. They did not have a marriage certificate or a signed partnership agreement. They had something more durable. They had a shared piece of land, a shared trust, and a small, hopeful orchard on a sunny slope, where the apricot seeds, now buried in the damp, welcoming earth, held the quiet, unshakable promise of a sweet and lasting harvest. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like this video and press the hype button to help share this tale with more people.